What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and today I have a pretty interesting PC build for you. Myself and 7 others were challenged by Mark from the Scattervolt YouTube channel to create the best ray tracing gaming PC we could for $600, with the one big stipulation being that we had to include an RTX 2060. The RTX 2060 is a $350 graphics card, meaning we had $250 for the rest of the parts. This includes the CPU, motherboard, RAM, cooler, power supply, case, and storage. And to be completely honest, this was pretty challenging to do, as the RTX 2060 is a very powerful graphics card, and to create a system for $250 that wasn't going to bottleneck the RTX 2060 was a very tall order. The rules were pretty simple. All parts had to be bought online to take out the randomness of local deals. No pre-builts, no mail-in rebates, and no deals from our viewers were allowed. And finally, all the games and benchmarks had to fit on the hard drive or SSD that was included in the PC. With all the rules set, we had a little over 3 weeks to collect all of our parts and start building. Going into this, I honestly wasn't sure what platform I was going to base my build around. I thought about basing my build around an older Intel platform, but I kept on coming back to the idea of using 1st gen Ryzen, and that's exactly what I did. I knew using a Ryzen 3 processor probably wouldn't have been a good idea just because of how powerful the 2060 was, and I knew getting something like a Ryzen 5 1600 would have been too much for this budget, so I decided to set my sights on a Ryzen 5 1400, which is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU with an unlocked multiplier. After making a post on r/hardware swap, I actually got a Ryzen 5 1400 with stock cooler for only $80 shipped. This was a pretty good deal in my opinion, and I honestly think it would have been harder to find another CPU with as much value as this R5 1400. Once I had the Ryzen 5 1400, it meant there was no turning back, and I had to base my entire build around this CPU. For the motherboard, I got a refurbished B350M MSI board from Newegg's eBay page. I got this for $45, and while the power delivery and VRM cooling doesn't inspire much confidence, this board worked well enough to get my CPU to a quick and dirty overclock of 3.7 GHz across all cores. The recent decline in price for DDR4 RAM was honestly part of the reason I was able to make a Ryzen system for so cheap. I ended up getting a 2x4GB kit of RAM at 2666 MHz from Amazon for $50 new. Obviously, Ryzen prefers much faster RAM, but this RAM worked at the advertised speed and a cache latency of 16. This RAM worked well for the build, but again, I would have preferred to get something a little bit faster. For storage, I went very basic, as going with an SSD over a hard drive isn't going to affect gaming performance at all. And to get an SSD with the capacity that I needed to fit the OS, all the games, and benchmarking software, it was going to be out of my budget. What I got was a 500GB Apple branded hard drive at 7200 RPMs from eBay for only $16. And while it does have an Apple logo on it, at the end of the day, it's just a regular hard drive, and it worked fine in this build. Now for the power supply, there isn't going to be much surprise in what I picked. I went with a 600 watt, 80+ certified EVGA power supply that I got on a midweek madness sale for $20. This is way more than enough power for this build, and at $20, you're really gonna have a hard time finding anything with a better value. These units go on sale for 20 bucks a couple times a month, and if you're looking for a cheap power supply, then look every Wednesday on EVGA's website at their B-stock listings, as on Wednesday they have what they call their midweek madness sale, where they have a ton of good deals. The case I went with is the HEC HX210. This is a compact micro ATX case with a full acrylic side panel and a full acrylic front panel. Even though it does have an acrylic front panel, there still is a decent amount of vents on the side of the front panel to allow air to get in. For 25 bucks, I think this was a pretty good deal, as it looks very good and includes a 92mm fan in the back. This case doesn't have amazing cable management, but putting in a good amount of work, I was able to get the build looking pretty clean. After getting all these parts, I realized I still had $11 to spend on the build. So what I did was purchase a 3-pack of green up here fans that were only $10 on Amazon with free shipping. I was only able to use 2 of the 3 fans as the back fan mount only supports up to 92mm fans. With that being said, these 2 fans did add a nice aesthetic touch and improved airflow a fair amount. And it also doesn't hurt that these green fans definitely tie in with the whole NVIDIA green theme. Going into testing, the combination of this RTX 2060 and $250 PC, I honestly wasn't sure how this combo was going to perform. We decided to test some games and benchmarks that take advantage of ray tracing, and to be honest, most of those tests absolutely wrecked this system. So before I get into the ray tracing benchmarks, I wanted to do a more standard test to give you guys a better idea how this will perform in games without ray tracing. In Far Cry 5 at max settings, the system received an average of 76 FPS, which is pretty good, and the system performs within 15% of my 1700X test bench in this test at 1440p. This shows that while there is definitely going to be a CPU bottleneck, in a game like Far Cry 5, it's honestly not going to be that noticeable. So now let's move on to the benchmarks that actually count for this competition. The first is Cinebench R20 to measure raw CPU power for each of our systems. My Ryzen 5 1400 at 3.7 GHz provided a score of 1764. The next up is Crystal Disk Mark, and I'll display the full results on the screen right now. So if you want to analyze the results, you're more than welcome to pause the video. But for the sake of brevity, these scores are pretty typical of a mechanical hard drive and nothing to get excited over. The next benchmark is the first ray tracing benchmark, which is the Port Royal test within the 3D Mark suite. This system produced a score of 3757 at the standard settings. Moving on to the first game tested, Battlefield 5, with the medium preset but DXR ray tracing set to ultra. The average frame rates were good, but the 1% lows were not so much. The system averaged 55 FPS with 1% lows of 3. This was super stuttery and honestly a pretty unenjoyable experience. The next game tested was Metro Exodus, another game with ray tracing support. I tested both the built-in benchmark and the first level of the campaign at 1080p high settings with DXR and DLSS enabled. With the built-in benchmark, my system averaged 54 FPS with 1% lows of 30. This was a fair bit lower than the actual gameplay, which averaged 88 FPS with unremarkable 1% lows of 11. This was an okay experience, but probably disabling DXR would have improved performance greatly. The last game tested was Anthem, and we were hoping it would have ray tracing support by the time we tested, but sadly, at the time of benchmarking, there wasn't any DXR support. At 1080p with medium settings, my system produced a lackluster average of 73 FPS. This was pretty disappointing, but I also know Anthem has a lot of optimization issues. In terms of using ray tracing in-game, this system really doesn't seem like it's up to the task. With that being said, modern games without ray tracing seem to run perfectly fine, with the main example being Far Cry 5, which I talked about earlier. I'm not sure if the poor 1% lows that my system produced had to do with how difficult the benchmarks were, or if they had to do with a flaw in my system somewhere. With that being said, I'm super excited to see what systems the other challengers have built and how their systems have scored. This was a very fun challenge, but if I had $600 to spend however I wanted, I probably would have changed the R5 1400 to a 2600, the 8GB of RAM to 16, the hard drive to an SSD, and the 2060 to a 1070. I think this would have been a much more well-rounded build, and performance still would have been pretty good. To be honest, I'm pretty happy with what I was able to put together for only $250 to pair with the 2060, and I'm hopeful that no one's outdone me too much. Please check out all the other builds that are linked in a playlist down below. It's the first link in the description. I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Mark from the Scattervolt YouTube channel for organizing this whole thing. I also want to thank all the other challengers that participated and helped make this one of the biggest PC build challenges on YouTube. And the final person I want to thank is NVIDIA for providing all the cards to us for this competition. Without them, this whole thing wouldn't have been possible. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like it if you like it, consider subscribing, and this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.